As a mixer, it's important that you have a system, because if you don't have a system, you're going to waste time and energy on deciding what to do next at every stage in the mix. I'm Rob Mazes from HomeStudioCentre.com. I hope you're doing incredibly well, and we're here today to talk all about having a mixing system and my mixing system and philosophy in general, which I call slow focus mixing. If you don't already have a mixing system, that's fine, a lot of people don't. But I'm here to tell you that you really do need one. And there's lots of ways you can go about mixing. Most people start by maybe start from the foundation, start from the kick drum or the bass guitar, and they bring in parts one by one and build up from the foundation upwards. I work completely differently, but more about that in a second. Now, the benefits of having a good solid mix system that works for you are huge. It means you can mix faster and you can actually get better mixes, so more quality in less time, which to me are the main two goals that we want to do with absolutely anything in mixing. But there's a third bonus, that it makes mixing more enjoyable, and this is also really important and also leads to better mixes, because the more excited you are, the more you're in the moment with the music, with the mix, the better your results are going to be. And mixing is all about speed in some ways, because as soon as you start listening to a track and as soon as you start listening to that piece of music on repeat and you start listening to that mix on repeat, you're racing against the clock, and every time you hear that track you're going to become less and less objective. Ear fatigue is going to set in, which is why it's important to have breaks, but also you're going to start to perceive the mix differently. You're going to get used to parts that initially sounded bad at first, but then because you've heard them over and over again, they start to sound good. There's so many negative side effects to taking too long mixing. So speed is of the essence, and having a good system helps you with that. So you know that having a system is important, but then what system is going to work for you? Well, you can try the kind of old school approach of starting with the most important part, like the vocal or the kick drum perhaps, or the bass part, and then bringing in instruments one by one. And there are some benefits to that. It means you can start with the vocal, for example, and then bring in other parts and craft them to sit around the vocal, or you can start with the low end and build up from there, so you've got a nice powerful low end. But I actually think this is quite a bad way to mix, and my approach is the complete opposite. I say start with the bigger picture and then start to slowly focus on the finer details as you progress through the mix. And there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, if you focus on individual channels and smaller details at the beginning of the mix, like the tone of your kick drum or the tone of the vocal or the relationship between the kick and bass, it's probably going to change when you get further down the mix, because you're not doing it in the context. If you're listening to those things in solo and you're tweaking them, once you have everything else in, you're probably going to have to go back to them anyway and readdress them. So it doesn't make sense to focus on small, fine details at the beginning of the mix, because you'll probably have to come back to them. So I recommend starting your mix by focusing on the bigger picture, working with things like balancing, muting, not even panning yet, but focusing on just getting the relationship right between the instruments, because that's going to make a huge impact on your mix, and you're focusing on the bigger picture before you then move on to things like EQ compression. But of course we can go into much more detail of that, and this is just my overall philosophy. Start big and then funnel down to the finer details and the more specific elements of your mix. The image you can see on the screen now summarizes how I apply the concept of slow focus mixing to my entire mixing process to develop a mixing system. So we're starting with the bigger picture at the top of the funnel with things like balancing and muting. Then we can move on to group processing before we move on to individual channels, because we're still focusing on making broad strokes and making big changes, focusing on the bigger picture. So we do that by processing the mix bus first and then the group buses before we move on to individual channels. So now we're really starting to get to those finer details of the tone of the kick drum, the tone of the vocal, maybe multiband compression, any processing we couldn't do on a group bus, like lead vocals, kicks, snares, etc. And then after we've basically got a finished mix, we can then move on to decoration and really start to focus on really fine details like automation, spot effects and effects as well. So enhancing choruses, enhancing verses, and then finally we just apply the finishing touches and we've got a finished mix. If you want to use this image in your mixes and use it as a reference, which I highly recommend, just click the link you see in the video or head to the link in the description and you can get access to that and some other cool free material. So let's go through each of those phases in a bit more detail now. Phase 0. which is before you're even going to look at the bigger picture, before you're going to do anything in your mix, which is why it's 0, not 1, is preparation is vital. And if you don't properly prepare your mix, then you're just not ready to mix, and you're going to have lots of problems down the line. So start off with things like organization, import your tracks, or start a new DAW, or if you're working with music that you've composed, I recommend bouncing it down and starting fresh in a new project. Go through, check your labels, check the colors, organize your project. Then you can go through and check your gain. So you can just play the track, have a listen, look out for any channels that look like they're particularly loud or quiet. So this one here, for example, is quite loud. So let's bring that down a bit with a trim so that it's sitting nearer -18, like so. And just go through, check none of your tracks are too loud. You don't have to be too specific with it. And then a crucial step here is to go through and send all of your individual channels to group buses. So by this I mean send all of your vocal parts, your lead vocal parts, to a stereo aux or a bus channel. It has a different term depending on your DAW. And then BV, so that's all the backing vocals, all the looped vocals, which is this kind of loop sample that I've got going on here. And then all vocals, so these are going to all vocals. After that, I've got a whole bus for the drums and all the drums. And then a parallel bus for parallel processing, electronic drums, because there's an acoustic drum kit and an electric drum kit, bass, piano, acoustic guitar, electric instruments, reverb, etc. So make sure you send all the channels to group buses. And this is really important. You're going to find out why in a second. But that's phase 0, is to prep your mix. So then we get to phase 1, and if you can remember, we're starting with the bigger picture. We're starting by focusing on the track as a whole. So to do that, really, we need to focus on balancing, because we don't want to focus on fine details yet, like individual channels or EQ or compression. We're just looking at the bigger picture. So just by starting with all the faders at 0 and then playing the mix for maybe just half an hour on repeat and just tweaking the individual channels until you've got a balance that you like. And don't be afraid here to mute channels. So you can see I've got quite a lot muted. So there was a rack tom mic and a floor tom mic, but the toms weren't being used, so mute them. There were 2 sets of overhead mics. I didn't need both of them, so I muted them. There was a room mic, which I didn't particularly like the sound of, so I muted that. And then on a lot of the instruments, there were 3 mics on each part. And I tried blending them together, but I actually found that the mix sounded better, because it's quite a dense mix, there's a lot going on, when I just had 1 mic from each part. So I thought about which mic I wanted, which microphones would complement each other, so a slightly lower tone on the piano and a slightly more aggressive tone on the right hand piano, and then maybe a higher guitar tone on one part and a lower guitar tone on another part. So just mute all the channels that aren't relevant, aren't necessary, don't add to the mix, don't add to the music, and focus on balancing. Just move the volume faders up and down. This is where the majority of your mix happens, is in this phase, when you get your static mix done with balancing. So that's the bigger picture, that's phase 1. So then after we've balanced our mix and we've got a static mix, we can go one level deeper and start to focus a bit more on finer details. So instead of jumping straight to the individual channels, because we're slowly focusing, we're funneling down, it makes more sense to actually start with the stereo bus, and then the group channels, and then the individual channels. So this is how I like to mix. I call it backwards mixing. And I've touched on this briefly before, but it's called backwards mixing because we're mixing from right to left. Most people set up their projects with the individual channels on the left, then their group buses, then their master fader, or their submix or submaster. So in fact, instead of mixing left to right, starting with your kick or your vocal and then working your way to the stereo bus, go from right to left, work backwards, and there's lots of benefits to this. Starting with processing on your stereo bus, A, saves time, B, it means you make big changes early on, so it boosts your confidence. C, it means if you are going to apply any compression or EQ on your master bus, you start with that, you're mixing into it, because if you just add it at the end, it's going to completely throw off your whole mix. And then 4, you can finish your mix with less plugins, which is good for CPU, but mostly for me, I think the less plugins you can use, the better. So we can make broad strokes on the master bus. And again, this follows that concept of starting with the big picture and not focusing on the finer details yet. After that, you can then mix on the group buses. So I've got all of the electric guitars going to one bus, and I've just got one plugin, and this is just applying EQ. Not even any compression there, it didn't need it. And then acoustic guitar, just EQ on the group bus. Same with piano, and then drums, we've probably got a bit more going on. We've got saturation and just gain staging. So I'm applying a lot of my processing on the group bus because you don't need to process the individual channels. If you want the guitar all to have a similar tone and sit in the same way in the mix, then you can process them on the group bus. If you want to make them sound a bit different and add some separation between them, that's fine. You can do that later when you're focusing on the individual channels. But again, now we're focusing on the bigger picture, so we don't want to start focusing on those finer details yet. So we do group processing. So that's phase 2, is group processing, which is essentially the beginning of the backwards mixing process, starting on the stereo bus, then the group channels, and then next in phase 3 we can focus on the individual channels. So now that you've applied processing on the group channels, there will be some processing that you need to do on individual channels, always. It would be really hard to do all of your mix just on group buses, because something like a kick drum, if you've only got one mic on the kick drum, you're probably not going to send that to its own group bus because it's just one channel. Or lead vocal, you're going to have to do most of the processing on the lead vocal channel itself, unless you have a few different parts that you've then bussed to one group. Or things like adding separation between guitars. If you've got a guitar on the left and on the right, you might want to give them different tones so that they don't blend together, so they have a bit more separation. There's loads of reasons. So now in phase 3, it's time to go through and apply your individual processing. So if you have a look through a mix, you can see on a lot of these channels, I've just got gain staging and nothing else going on. Some channels I do have more processing because I had to. So good example here, bass DI. I've got a bass amp and a DI, so I had to do some individual processing to make the DI sound how I wanted before it went to the bus. Same with this vinyl noise effect. It's just a single effect. It's literally like a vinyl crackle, so I had to apply some individual processing there. Then if I wanted to make these electronic parts sound different, I had to, these are electronic drum parts, I had to make them sound different on the channel. Another example was kick. I only had one kick drum mic, so of course I'm doing that on the channel itself. Snare, I only had one snare mic, so again, doing that on the individual channel. So in phase 3, go through and apply any processing that you need to apply, any EQ, compression, multiband compression, whatever it is, on the individual channels to fix the problems and to finish the mix in the areas that you couldn't address on group buses. So that's phase 3, individual channels. So then we have phase 4, which is decoration. So now it's time to start adding in effects, maybe parallel processing, automation as well. So this is when we're going to start automating the volume of parts, because now we are starting to really get to the finer details. We've basically got a finished mix here, but now we're starting to decorate that, add excitement, enhance the music. So perhaps we can make the chorus wider than the verse in terms of panning. Perhaps we could add an effect in the chorus that isn't in the verse. We can make the chorus a bit louder. Maybe certain parts, like a guitar, is too loud in one verse but not loud enough in the other, so we can automate the volume. So we're starting to really look at finer details in the mix now. Things like spot effects as well here we can start adding in this phase. So on this vocal part here, I've got a line and I just wanted to add a delay just to the last word. So we're getting really specific here, looking at the really fine details. And I'm just doing that by automating the send to a delay. Another thing you're going to want to do in this phase when you start addressing the individual channels is to actually start panning, because until now I recommend working in mono when you're applying EQ, compression, when you're balancing, applying your group processing, etc. But now that we are looking at the individual channels, we can start to pan them. And I recommend using 50-50 panning, I call it, which is basically LCR panning, so only doing hard left, hard right or center for most of the mix, and that makes it really wide, gives you lots of space, but then occasionally putting something halfway between the two. So you can see I've got something here that's halfway left and something here that's halfway right. So I call this 50-50 because you're focusing on the 50% and the 100%. So 0, hard left, hard right, and then the gaps in between. But don't fill the whole stereo field, just focus on those key points. So now in the final phase, phase 5, we've basically finished our mix. We've started with the big picture with balancing. We worked our way down to the fine details like effects and spot effects and automation. So the mix is finished. We need to take a break now, go away for maybe a day or at least a few hours, come back, turn off the monitor and have a listen, or just listen with your eyes shut, and take some notes on your computer or on a notepad of just what needs addressing, what needs fixing, compare it to your reference. See if the low end needs addressing, the top end, if there's certain instruments that are too loud at parts, and just make a list of problems, go through and address them one by one, maybe repeat that a few times, and then your mix is done. You can just do the final finishing touches like dithering and limiting your mix if you're not getting it mastered, and you're finished. So just to summarize now, let's go back to that image. Start with the bigger picture, balancing, muting, then move on to group processing, things like backwards mixing. So starting with the mix bus, then the group buses, then the individual channels. And now we're starting to focus on the much smaller details like the tone of the kick drum and the snare drum, bass DI, and anything you couldn't do on a group channel. And then we're going to focus on decoration because the mix is finished. Now we're just enhancing it. So this is really fine details like automation, spot effects on single words, etc. And then finally just round it up with some finishing touches, going through making a list of problems, addressing them until you're happy with the mix. Now that concept of slow focus mixing, starting with the bigger picture and slowly focusing on the finer details, can be applied to other areas. Not just the entire mixing process, but we can actually apply it to the way that we process individual channels as well. So this image you see now summarizes how I view kind of processing in individual channels and the order that I like to work in. So if we're looking at, say, a kick drum, we want to start with the bigger picture. So the thing that's going to have the biggest impact, the biggest overall impact on the tone, the way it sits in the mix and everything else is the balance. It's that simple. It's the volume of the kick drum. So start with balancing. Spend lots of time on that, making sure that's perfect before you focus on any finer details. And then after balancing, we can then go one level more. We can zoom in one more level to make smaller adjustments to the tone with equalization and the dynamics with compression. So now we're starting to focus a bit more on the finer details. After that, we might notice that there's a problem in the low end that can only be addressed in multiband compression, for example. Then maybe subtle effects or parallel processing that could enhance the tone. And then finally, things like automation and really finer details. Maybe there's just a certain verse or a certain phrase where the kick drum's too loud. We can just reduce that with automation. So we're starting to really focus on the finer details on the bottom end of that. So remember this at all times. Start with the big picture. Focus on the finer details at the end. If you do it backwards, you're always going to be working against yourself. You're going to be swimming upriver. If you start with things like automation and subtle effects, before you've even thought about balancing, EQ and compression, then you're working in a completely bizarre way to me. And that's never going to work. You're never going to get the sound you want because you're starting with those details before you know the context or what you're really trying to do because you haven't fixed it earlier on. So bear that in mind as well. Again, I'll send this image to you as well if you go and sign up. Just click the link in the description or in the video now. So that's it for slow focus mixing. Hope you find that useful. Just remember that overall concept, apply it to areas of your mix. Head to the link in the description if you want to get those images and if you want to get weekly emails from me and loads of other cool bonuses, just head to that link. Don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube, like this video if you found it helpful, and also I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me what other elements of the mixing, recording process you think you can apply that concept to, of starting big and ending small. How could you apply it to recording? How could you apply it to editing even? So leave a comment, love to hear from you. If you have any questions as well, I'll get back to you as soon as I can, and see you very soon.